Is it freeze or is it stop? Nervous system time. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Remind podcast. My name's David Masterton and I'm joined with Dr. Ashleigh Moreland, and we're doing like a 5-part series on nervous system, flight, fight, freeze, fawn, all of those. So go back to, and I'm going to cheat, episode 81, which we kind of talk about all of it, and we're in this sort of process of just taking a little snapshot on each of them. And today is freeze. What do you think of freeze, Ash?
Freeze is fascinating. Really interesting because you asked a question in the previous episode about how is the mental checking out with flight different to freeze, because there's stillness in both of them, right? Or there could be. And it's really interesting because in the animal kingdom, freezing is a strategy that animals will use where if they're still, they're less visible to their predators.
Yeah.
Right? So essentially, from a physical perspective, freezing looks like you are rigid, you're still, you're unable to move, you're absolutely like completely binge watching Netflix on the couch, unable to get up and be productive. So freeze actually more closely looks like depression, whereas flight looks like anxiety. So someone's coming to me and they're telling me they've got symptoms of depression, and this is behaviorally what this looks like in their lives. That's a pretty big indication that their nervous system has actually flopped over into a freeze response. So from a psychological perspective, this is things like brain fog, dissociation, feeling of detachment, numbness, or like feeling almost stuck, paralyzed, can't move forward. Dissociation is a freeze response as well, because you're literally like numbing out your whole experience of this physical flesh body. So I look at freeze, when someone goes into freeze, it's actually probably the most serious out of all of the trauma responses. And I say that because trigger warning or content warning, I'm going to use a physical violence example. So if that's triggering for you, then maybe skip ahead 5 minutes. But if you imagine like someone is being physically abused, and they try to fight their abuser, but they are not strong enough. They try to run away, but they're not fast enough. And the abuse is still going to keep happening. Their only option is to completely disconnect from their body and completely numb out the experience, because they can't stop it any other way. And so when that experience is so overwhelming and so threatening that they can't fight it and they can't outrun it, their only option is to just completely numb themselves out and wait to die. That's why I say freeze is the biggest red flag for me, is when some of these behaviours are manifesting.
Gotcha. So the best way when we talked about sort of freeze, I pictured, because I'm fairly dramatic at heart, imagine you're out camping in the woods, beautiful night, no tent, and you wake up peacefully and there's a lion just face to face. And you just, like you said, you're not going to fight it, you're not going to punch it in the face. You
might try. You might, because we all know that your default is a fight.
Pretty tough guy, but I know my limits. Trying to outrun it, no. I mean, even the fastest human would have a real hard time outrunning a lion. And so you just almost like you shallow your breathing. You just, And so, I mean, that's an appropriate response in that physical situation. But like, as you're sort of saying, in another physical situation, which is what you sort of mentioned before, in a relationship where that line's a human that happens to be in a relationship with you, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
That brings you
Or
into
a boss in your business, or
Yep.
yeah,
It's
totally.
basically something that you feel completely helpless and overpowered in some shape or form. Because something that could be really quick, right? Let's just say a fly. A fly is very quick.
Yeah.
But it could be the fastest thing on earth. I can't outrun a fly. I'm not scared of it. But I think it's the fact if something's quick and it can harm you, I think it's that's where I think fawn comes into it. And you mentioned earlier that you sort of, when you say flopped into
Freeze?
fawn, huh?
Freeze?
Oh, sorry,
Flopped into
freeze.
freeze?
Flopped into freeze. It kind of feels like there's like a hierarchy. That's sort of like at the start.
It's survival strategies.
Okay, yeah. So fight. If you can't fight it, you run it. If you can't run it, you freeze. If you can't freeze, like. So that's really interesting that as we get further into it, if you sort of associate depression and freeze together, it means that what people have done is on the escalation point, they're potentially deeper in it than someone that's just constantly angry, maybe. Or someone who's just, or, you know.
I see, yeah, I'm following your logic, and I kind of would say there's possibly some validity to that. I think also part of it is just what strategy were we taught? Because these are all just strategies, right? So let's take trauma responses completely out of it and go, let's talk about tying our shoelaces. How are we taught? How do you tie your shoelaces? How do I tie mine? It's simply a strategy for getting our shoelaces from two, cords to a bow. There's different ways, different strategies that we can do that. And I would say that when it comes to survival responses, we cycle through the strategies until we find the one that's most appropriate. And generally it's our early life experiences, the dynamic of our household, what's modeled to us by our parents, what's considered acceptable and appropriate. So for instance, particularly for females, I find that the fight response is completely detached. Like, not always, but more commonly, because environmentally the fight response is less appropriate. But females tend to be praised for the characteristics of a flight response. So it's really interesting. Like, I observed my mum being busy, like busy bee, always doing something, And so that was what was kind of modeled to me, and fight wasn't. So sometimes it can be based on that. And I can see your logic where sometimes there is a hierarchy where you try one and that hasn't worked. You try the next, that doesn't work. So you resort to that. Yeah, like I said, the freeze one is the...
Because you mentioned something which sort of triggered my curiosity is if someone comes to you and you identify them as being constantly in freeze, an antenna goes up a little bit higher, like you're just a little bit more observant, like, okay, this is probably a more, and I might be wrong in what you said, but it's probably like a more chronic issue. There seems to be a little bit more going on if someone's in a freeze response when they flopped over into freeze, or is that something I've just
missed? It doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be. So think about the example that you gave with like sleeping, camping in the forest and a tiger comes. That's not a chronic thing. That's literally an acute thing, but it's an acute thing with a very, very highly intense experience of threat. So another example, I have seen freeze and people get trapped in a freeze response when there's been significant physical threat or physical pain. Burns victims, I have seen freeze be very, very common because the intensity of the pain and the experience of that physical injury is so overwhelming to the senses of the physical body that like the soul kind of disconnects from it and numbs it out because it would just be so traumatic. Another really common one, which is bizarre, is people who are hit by cars. You hear stories of they'll be like, I watched my body, or I was like out of my body, or I blacked out, and it wasn't until I came to that, it's like I lost a section of time. Those things can be acute freeze responses where literally it's not a chronic thing. It's just the intensity of that experience is so big, and there's no other strategy that can help us.
But what about the freeze aspect without any known physical, or sort of say catalyst?
Stimulus. Yeah.
Right?
So then that's going to be mental, right? So that might be, again, we spoke in the last episode briefly on the unresolved traumas, belief systems, the way that we're perceiving things. That would be a perceived threat. So for instance, if I have a perception that if someone rejects me, that I am not safe, not lovable, not enough, that is what my nervous system is responding to as a threat. Well, then I might be in an absolute state of paralysis at a job interview where someone asks a question and I haven't scripted that answer, and then I completely shut down. And so this is kind of the difference between flight versus freeze. Flight is, you're kind of checking out mentally, but there's a lot of mental activity.
And you're constantly doing things.
You're still thinking.
Doing. Yeah.
Well, it could even be thinking. So you might be physically still, but you're thinking a lot. Whereas freeze is like absence of thought entirely. It's like I am completely shut down, completely disconnected. It's like there's nothing there. And so in auditions, in interviews, in those kinds of things, there's actually no threat. It's not that there's a physical threat, but the intensity of fear or threat of the rejection or the judgment or opinions is the very thing that feels so overwhelming to the nervous system that it activates that freeze response, and you just go completely, I'm shut down. I'm completely like, if I was a robot, you've powered me down.
Gotcha.
There's no thinking, there's no analysing, it's just...
So, like, let's just go back to an interview, because everyone loves to be interviewed for a job or audition, right? So someone who's in a flight response that gets asked a question they're not prepared for will sit there and just go Rolodex in their head of all the things that they should be saying, but yes. it still could be, but there's like
it could look like that, yes.
Yeah. I mean, just as a broad example, where freeze would be, I'm unprepared for this. It's like, lights are off.
Yeah. It's like, bleh.
And there's no narration, there's no nothing's happening. And then you sort of just come to and go, what? How did my whole mouth, head just stop completely?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Okay, so that's...
And so, I said before in the last episode with flight, my husband and I use the terminology, lights are on, no one's home. Mm-hmm. So that means like there's still activity. It's just that like, I'm not here and I'm not listening and I'm not processing what you're saying and all this kind of stuff. Freeze is lights are off.
Yeah.
Powered down. There's no power.
But you're still there.
Home.
Like,
it's like... Well, yeah, potentially.
Like I think when you said sort of flight, there's like a dissociation, but that's like guess what? I'm just going to dip out. But from what I'm gathering with freeze, it's sort of like I'm not having the choice to dip out. I'm not dissociating. It's just I've been shocked into freeze.
Well, dissociation is freeze. In that, when we dissociate from our physical experience, we're numbing out that experience.
Okay. So
a really...
You go.
You're right. I was going to say a really interesting thing about freeze is that how we approach freeze is very different to how we approach fight and flight. So, for instance, if we're in freeze... if I observe that someone's in freeze, the things I'll get them doing is things like body stuff. I will be getting them to shake, getting them to pat their arms, pat their legs, getting blood flowing in their body. because I want you to imagine they have just dumped so much adrenaline and so much stress hormone into their body that they've got to actually kind of start metabolizing it. And that can help to, I call it defrost. Our goal is to defrost, right? So how are we going to defrost? We're going to metabolize all of those, not overflow, that's not the right word.
We'll call it coolant.
Maybe.
We'll just call it coolant. Just, it's freezing.
Maybe.
Right?
But the idea is to defrost. Unlike a fight and flight, we want to bring our energy down. We want to do our breath work. We want to do our, mindfulness activities and grounding and all those sorts of things. But with a freeze, we actually kind of need to bring our energy up. We actually need to defrost. We need to shake. We need to move. We need to, like I said, patting, jumping. That's the stuff that's going to shift that stuck energy that has actually kept us frozen. So the response to it is very, very different as well. And I think this is really tricky because quite often, how often do you hear, oh, if you're stressed, exercise is good for stress? And something I didn't really understand until I was forced to understand it was that prescribing exercise for people without understanding the state of their nervous system can actually push them from a fight or flight response into a freeze response because they're adding more stresses to the body. So I was doing F45 training like 5 or 6 days a week. And as a product of that F45 training, I was finding myself in a more frozen state simply because that was an added stressor to my body. And it's really bizarre. Whereas I am in a season now where I do a lot of Pilates. I do a lot of really gentle exercise where there's movement. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I'm there going, wow, like we needed an episode about it. This sort of whole exercise, movement / nervous system. But I was going to say, like, you feel 100% better in my mind with movement. I guess what you're saying is high intensity exercise versus strength training versus movement versus flexibility like Pilates and yoga and all of that. Movement is important, like full stop. By the way, David, if you're watching, you might need to just rewind that part and listen to it again.
Preaching to yourself here.
Yeah, but exercise, like the actual cardio versus all of that, get to understand where you're sitting in your nervous system first, because you could be doing something which is not necessarily helping you or pushing you in a further direction because it is a stressor.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
gotcha.
Totally. So really, really interesting. People, I guess if you are in a freeze and you're finding yourself that it often looks like someone who's really unmotivated, someone who, might seem directionless, might be wasting their life away. I know for me, I tend to be flighty. My husband tends to be freeze. So flighty for me tends to be quite on the anxious side, whereas freezy tends to be more on the depressive, despondent side. So really, really interesting to understand the dynamics. But what I now understand is that if I see my husband in that state, one of the best things I can do for him is to get us moving. And if he can sort of shake up that stuck, trapped energy that for whatever reason there's been some kind of threat in the environment that has activated that freeze response, it allows compassion, it allows understanding, it allows grace over observing people in their stress responses, because how often do we want to make it about ourselves? How often do we see someone else acting out in their stress response, which is purely a reflexive survival response, and we want to make it about ourselves or think that, it's anything other than their perception and threat response system that's defaulting to survival in the only way they know how.
And look, I think the main message there is spend more time sitting in it, whatever it is. So you can start to figure out, am I in a flight response, a fight response, a freeze response, or coming into the next episode, great segue, fawn response. We'll keep this one short and sweet, guys. Go back to episode 81. That's where it all kicked off. Next episode, next week's going to be the fawn response, and let us know what you think. Thumbs
we'll
up,
be here.
Subscribe. Another week, another Remind podcast episode. Bye-bye.
See you guys.